The topic I'm going to discuss today is familial influence on suicidality. And I want to start off by giving you the overarching hypothesis so that you can keep it in mind as we go through the background. The hypothesis is that family history of suicide increases the risk and probability of suicidality, or in other words, it increases the risk and probability of a person committing suicide. And just to give you a little bit background on the significance, suicide is the fifth leading cause of death among adolescents and young adults. And the suicide rates have increased substantially in the military in recent years since 2005. And in fact, in the war in Iraq, there are more people who have died from suicide in our own homeland than there are who have died in the actual battlefield. Identifying risk factors that may help in understanding the increase may be helpful in identifying suicide victims or potential suicide victims. So, is there an increase in the suicide gene or a gene that affects suicide, or is there selection against a gene? Suicide can basically be defined as violence towards oneself, and violence can be broadly identified as either premeditated or as an impulsive aggressive act. So premeditated act is something that someone actually sits there and thinks through, weighs out their choices in life and decides to commit murder, which is what the quotation at the bottom is more identifying: to die in order to avoid the pains of poverty, love, or anything that is disagreeable is not part of a brave man, but of a coward. However, impulsive aggression can be described as an act that's an uncontrollable act. A lot of people who impulsively commit suicide generally say that they don't remember attempting the suicide, they don't remember going through the act. And it is just an overwhelming sense of fear that comes over them that causes them to commit the suicide. Impulsive aggression is classified as a DSM-4 mental disorder, and because of that, we believe that there are biological factors that influence suicidality. And more specifically, research has identified that there are alterations in the 5-HT system or serotonin system in people who have committed suicide, and these are postmortem studies. They show that in their blood, in plasma samples, there is low amounts of serotonin compared to normal controls, or those who have died from other causes besides suicide. And there's also an alteration in 5-HT2 receptors in the brain. In addition to the alterations in serotonin system, a lot of studies have also identified changes in the stress response. In other words, there's an increase in corticosterone release, and also there is an increase in GR receptor expression. GR receptor is one of the receptors for corticosterone. So my question is there a heritability factor that causes suicidal behavior? And if there is, what are the implications for human evolution? And again, my overarching hypothesis is that a family history of suicide increases the probability of suicidality in relatives. So in order to answer these questions, I decided to do a meta-analysis of studies that have already been done. And so the first step is to identify eligible studies. And I used studies that had suicidal patients and had identified which of those patients also had a family member or any family members that also committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide. I only identified suicidal patients that had attempted, or also those that had a high probability of committing suicide as diagnosed by a clinician. Second step was to extract the data from the previous literature, and then the final step is to do a statistical analysis to identify if there was a high chance or higher chance of suicide in patients that had a family history of suicide. And so in order to do that, I used the Mantel-Haenszel method, which tests for effect size, variance, and test of heterogeneity. And the statistics program I used was RevMan 5.0. I identified 8 studies that I use Brent, Melham, Mann, Sulsinger, Rusin, Carballo, Nuremberg, and Roy. And out of those studies, identified approximately 22,000 patients total. Out of those patients, those that were identified who had attempted or were identified to be high in rates of suicide and also had a family history of suicide was about 627. Those who had tried to commit suicide or identified as being high probability of committing suicide but did not have a family history was approximately 279. Those who did not commit suicide who did have a family history identified about 10,000, and those who had no suicide, no family history used as controls was about 11,000. Statistical analysis shows that the odds ratio is about 2.518. So, in other words, there is about 2.5-fold increase in chance of a person committing suicide if they had a family history of suicide. The confidence interval is approximately between 2.2 and 3. And a test of heterogeneity in the chi-squared test, so the chi-square is equal to 80.8, and the p-value is less than 0.0001, which is significantly different. So according to the data, those with a family history are about 2.5 times more likely to commit suicide than those who did not. And the percentage of those that actually committed suicide within the family history cohort is low, indicating a strong gene-environment interaction. So, in other words, it is possible that because the environment is changing, it is selecting against genes involved in suicide, or in other words, genes that increase impulsive aggression or genes that increase aggression in general are being selected against. And that might explain the increase in suicide rate. Some of the limitations in this study is the accuracy is questionable because the identification of suicide attempts or identification of those who have attempted to commit suicide is right now just by self-reports. And so there's a possibility that those who have those who have attempted to commit suicide the rate is actually higher than what is reported, because it's unlikely that everybody will admit to have committed suicide versus those who voluntarily lied and say they have committed suicide. Also, these studies are taken from different environments. Some are from the United States, some are from Canada, some are from Scandinavia, and also some are from hospital reportings, and some are just from separate clinic reportings. And so the environment is different between all of the studies identified, and so those could possibly cause be a confound in the data as well.